So good morning. My name is Eric Liu, and I am the founder of Citizen University and the executive director of a program here at the Aspen Institute on citizenship and American identity. And I'm really thrilled to have this conversation here with our really distinguished panelists on this broad topic of what our election this year says about who we are becoming as a country. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce our panelists in turn, and the way we're going to flow today is I'm going to just pose an opening question and ask them all to speak for a few minutes to that opening question, and then from there we're going to just flow into an organic conversation and leave a chunk of time as well for a room-wide conversation, both if you have questions for us, but also if you're moved just to share your own thoughts on this topic. I just wanted to kind of frame it up a little bit with some context, both about the work that we're doing here at the Aspen Institute and about, of course, this moment in our country's history. Our program is a relatively new program here at Aspen. We launched it about a year ago. And the premise of the whole program is that we're at a time right now of such incredible tectonic shifts in our country's life. A time of nearly unprecedented economic inequality and concentration of wealth. A time of profound demographic change, where people cite the figure 2042 as the day when the majority of Americans will be non-white, but in fact that day is already upon us when you look at babies being born in the United States. New births are already a majority babies of color in this country, and so the idea of minority is soon to be, if not a word put into disuse, a word then put into a very different context. And at the same time, of course, we need no elaboration of the ways in which our politics in this country, at least at the national level, have become so incredibly polarized and so, in a sense, ritualized in their polarization that it's really hard to think of a time, which wasn't all that long ago, when people in national politics actually were able to get things done. And so, all of these trends combining right now are, of course, exemplified by the presidential campaigns we see right now, and not just Donald Trump, but also the emergence of Bernie Sanders on the Democratic side, and the rise, as we'll hear about, of people, particularly young people, who affiliate with neither part of the two-party duopoly. And so this profound set of shifts, but particularly the demographic shifts, and the ways in which this animating question for our work in my program here at Aspen, which is simply this: who is us? Who is us now? When we talk about an American identity, when we talk about our national community, what do we mean? Who do we mean? Who do we include in that? And who gets to even speak and utter the word we and us? And all of these things are contested right now in very exciting ways, in the Black Lives Matter movement, in the movement of Dreamers, in the $15 Now movement, in the rise of the Tea Party over the last many years. In cross-ideological ways right now, there are people claiming anew their voice and their place, and ultimately a sense of power in political life. And we are joined by some pretty remarkable practitioners and analysts here in our country right now to help us make sense of this question in the context of the election, who is us? So let me quickly introduce them and then pose this opening question. Immediately to my left, Matt Barreto. He is a professor at UCLA, both of political science and Chicano studies, and also co-founder of Latino Decisions, a polling and strategy firm that is a few years old now. Yes. We'll talk more about that. Next, Kristen Soltis Anderson, who, if you've been on campus in some of these sessions already, you've gotten to hear from her. She's the author of a book called The Selfie Vote, about millennials, and she's a columnist for the Washington Examiner, as well as co-founder of Echelon Insights, another strategy and polling firm, and a commentator on a lot of political television shows. Next, Stan Greenberg, President CEO of, lead partner of Greenberg Quinlan Rosner, and he is one of the country's most respected, long-standing Democratic pollsters, and somebody who's got a new book out as well called America Ascendant, about many of the themes actually that I've just previewed here, and has been doing this work analyzing these trends not only in the United States but globally, as his practice is worldwide. And then last but not least, and color coordinated both with me and Kristen, DeRay McKesson, who is a leading activist in the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the co-creators of Campaign Zero, which you have probably heard about over the course of the last few days, a campaign that he and Brittany Packnett and several other leading activists from the Black Lives Matter movement have launched to bring down to zero in this country the number of police-caused fatalities of civilians and citizens. And DeRay will also talk about, I think just in the last half day, has announced a new gig. He's going to be running human capital for the City of Baltimore Public Schools. And I believe his first day of school, so to speak, is tomorrow. So we're glad to catch him here before he has to go to work here. So let me just throw open this conversation with this common question that I want to invite you each to speak to for 3 or 4 minutes, which is simply, what does this 2016 presidential campaign, this incredible, unprecedented circus of a campaign that we're having, tell us about the America we are becoming?
So I remember in 2012, Ron Brownstein, who is also here at the Ideas Festival, wrote an article where he interviewed an unnamed senior strategist on the Romney campaign, who basically said, look, our goal is to win about 60% of the white vote. And we think if we can hit that target, we'll be good. And then added the sentence, but this is the last time anyone will try this. And of course, as we now know, it was sort of one time too many to try that. That Mitt Romney did get almost, or about 60% of the white vote in the last presidential election, but because of the enormous demographic change that's happening, it was inadequate. What's really fascinating, however, is that in this election, it seems that my party, the Republican Party, is doubling down on that strategy at a moment when the demographic trends have not shifted in any way, yet we now have a candidate who is sort of an expression of this like last gasp of an old way of thinking about things, an old way of being. And I think we are likely to find out that, of course, this is still one time too late or 2 times too late to try this strategy because of how much America is demographically changing.
It's fascinating. You know, Matt, in answer to that original question, too, thinking about this notion of last gasp that Kristen's talking about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one of the things that's already so interesting about 2016 is just the dichotomy in terms of what Kristen talked about, how the campaigns have conducted themselves vis-a-vis the changing American electorate. And so on the Republican side, you had during the primaries, not just Donald Trump, but Ted Cruz and others who were really running on against these demographic changes and, you know, bringing back the sort of Tea Party message of I want my country back. And many people of color saw this as, you know, a direct assault against our place in America. And then on the Democratic side, you had complete contrast between a very close election where both Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton were scrambling to try to win the black vote, to try to win the Latino vote as it went to the South, as it went to the Southwest. I mean, these communities were at the forefront of the Democratic primary in 2016. So I think you see a real contrast there. And obviously, because the nation is changing demographically, when you get to November and you get back to the Romney strategy, you need to have a more inclusive strategy to win in November. And I think that, you know, is a lesson that we can all take from 2012. And it seems as though, at least in the early runnings of 2016, that the Democratic candidates were doing far more outreach to try to be more inclusive to the changing American electorate. And the Republicans, I think, as Kristen said, were continuing, not just continuing, but even stronger than Romney in terms of trying to go for a white vote only strategy.
Stan, in America Ascendant, your new book, you talk both about these demographic trends, but also a set of other revolutions that are afoot in the United States right now. And so, again, same question, what does this election tell us about these revolutions and these changes in the America we're becoming?
Okay. Thank you for this, the Ideas Panel. Thank you, Eric, for organizing it on this topic. And I'm actually going to try to come at it in a kind of detoxicated way, less political way, and really talk about America and its values and what's going on here. It's not, but it is the election I expected. I did think this would be a shattering election for I think the GOP, I thought this is an end game of an era of battle against the dominant trends in the country. The biggest piece of this is that if you look at the dominant trends and you're talking about racial, and it's not just race. You're talking about racial minorities. You're talking about a majority of unmarried households. If you talk about minorities, unmarried women, millennials, and seculars, just every one of those groups is growing at a dramatic pace. They will be way over 60% of the electorate, and that's 12 points more than they were 4 years ago. It's just a huge change. Now, so if you listen to them, their values of this dominant group that's going to, I think, with an exclamation point, shatter the old system in this election. These voters believe in equality, tolerance, empathy, individual autonomy, equal expression. They believe in education. They believe in science and technology as a way of learning truth. They are dismissive of religious absolutes. Now, would you know that? If you look at the commentary on this election, and actually, so the election itself is actually affecting this conversation. Because no one knows, they haven't read my book. They don't know the end. They don't know that Trump is going to lose. People are watching him win. And so there's this huge self-doubt about what we actually do believe, because they think we're an right now, in our polls we did last week, by way over 2 to 1, people say immigration makes us a stronger country, not causes problems. It's the exact opposite of the same polls that we ask in Britain. This country believes in immigration, believes in diversity, believes in tolerance, believes in new family structures. But nobody knows, including the people who form the new majority, because they're doubting their neighbors. There's a breakdown of trust because they're watching this play out. And so I think this is going to be a disruptive and amazing moment when this election happens, when people begin, not just who won and lost, but what values are dominant, what's the country.
So that is a fascinating segue to DeRay, this question of it's not just about the mechanics of the parties and the horse race, and it's not even just about the values dimension that Stan described, but it is about this notion of this disconnect between what's actually happening in our communities and the stories that we're getting, the narrative that we're getting and consuming and then spreading, right? And so obviously both in your work as an activist on the ground and as a thought leader in shaping narrative here, I'm curious your take as well on this opening question.
Yeah, I think it's also a question of what do people expect from the government and what do people do when those expectations aren't met. So when I think about protests, there are so many people, I think, who are, we met with Hillary and Bernie and sat across from Hillary, and I said, Hillary, I'm worried that you take for granted that people aren't going to vote. Like, I'm worried that in the movement, there are going to be young people in November who just say, I'm going to withhold my vote from a system that has never served me. And if the Democrats, don't figure out how to talk to those people, I think that'll be a real loss. And I think that it is not just about race, but I think that race has become this axis by which people are starting to think about a whole set of issues. So we think about the Democrats are talking about race and justice and equity in ways that they were not before. I think about, the protests hit Bernie, all of a sudden it's like this long racial justice platform. Hillary, it took her a long time to get to a racial justice platform, but we got there. And some of Trump's most memorable statements are about, they are like bigoted racist language, right? Like this axis of race actually has become what is so key in this election. I'm interested to see if people will build coalitions that will hold the parties accountable. What makes me nervous about Trump, there are a host of things that make me nervous about Trump, but one of the things that make me nervous about Trump is that he could actually govern without black people. He could govern without a coalition of black people. Hillary can't govern without a coalition of black people or a coalition of Latino. It will be impossible for her to govern in that way. And that makes me that keeps me hopeful about what is possible in this work. But I think there are a lot of people who feel like all the choices are not good. And in that space, people, I think, are tired of this idea of the lesser of two evils. What we tell people is we think that there's one not great choice and one evil. right? That this is not actually the lesser of two evils, that there's one evil and one not great choice. But there are people who don't believe that. And the last thing I'll say is that, like, as somebody who was in the street in Ferguson and Baltimore and Minneapolis and so many other cities, so many people told us in those days, like, you should vote, right? And we're sitting here like, we voted our whole lives. I got tear gas, pepper spray, LRAD, MRAPed, all that stuff, and like voting wasn't the answer. And I think that there's an institution of people who have not framed voting as one tool in a toolkit. They have framed it as like the answer. And I think there's a generation of people who are like pushing back against this idea that if you don't vote, like you don't care about the world. And I think the message should be like voting is one of the many ways you can participate, and you should participate like this.
I want to come back in a little bit to this question of these forms of participation, because one of the things that is notable about your just your own path of citizenship is that you've combined this on-the-ground work of protest in Ferguson and elsewhere with a decision to try to enter into the system, having run for mayor of Baltimore and now working in government. And so I want to come back to that in a moment. But Kristen, what Stan was saying a moment ago, if you parse it a little bit, Stan is essentially saying, if I'm hearing you right, that for all the anxiety that we have in the country right now and all the sense that we're super evenly divided and it might just go to Trump, A, Stan is basically implying Trump will lose, and B, when that happens, that it will be, in I suppose a positive sense, a wake-up call, that we'll suddenly realize we were far more inclusive, tolerant, so on and so forth as a country than we are worrying we are today. But for you, Kristen, in thinking about your colleagues and fellow travelers, both in the GOP formally, but also in the right generally, because I don't think those two things overlap anymore, right? If you grant Stan's premise there, that Trump is going to lose, and then when he loses, we're going to have this wake-up call and realize, wow, like we're actually a way more inclusive, tolerant, society than we thought we were. As a leading Republican strategist, where do you want to pivot the right to meet that moment then?
So I am a firm believer that change is happening in America very quickly, and that all of this technological, economic, and cultural change is something that the right should embrace and lean into, rather than push back against and struggle against and try to avoid. That I think there are far more wins that we can gain. So let's take, for example, the participation question. How can, say, a young person who distrusts the system participate and create change? Something that I've seen in a lot of research is that for a lot of young people who are disappointed in the system, something that they want to do to create change is through the work they do in their jobs, whether it's starting a business, starting a nonprofit, they want to solve problems outside of government. So as a conservative, as someone who's kind of skeptical that government institutions are always the best way to solve a problem, I should be celebrating this. I should be so glad that people are now saying, maybe I'll start a company that'll solve a problem, or maybe I'll start a nonprofit that solves a problem. These are the sorts of opportunities that I think the right should be taking advantage of and celebrating, rather than saying, oh, these millennials, they're so silly. Oh, the kids these days, oh, all of these changes are taking my country away from me. I think there's much more for the right to celebrate and get excited about. What concerns me about this election is I think that Stan's prediction that at the end of this election, if Trump loses, there will be this wake-up call that, look, America has changed and everything is great and let's move forward. I don't actually think that's going to happen, because I think, at least on the right, there will be enough disagreement about who is at fault for Trump happening in the first place that there will not be agreement about what the right should do to move forward. And there will still, I think this election will not be a clarifying moment for the right. I think it will continue to make things muddled until at least, I frankly think the right will be in a state of controversy and disarray and uncertainty about where we move until somebody actually wins the White House.
Yeah, Matt.
Can I piggyback on that? And Chris and I had a discussion yesterday afternoon that was quite similar to just this specific point, and so I just want to add something that was brought up there, which is that the same question was posed after the Romney loss, that it was the largest Latino turnout for a Democrat, that it was the largest Asian American turnout for a Democrat, that African American turnout remained robust in 12 as it did in 8, and even though Romney hit that 59% number with whites, he still lost handily. And the Growth and Opportunity Report autopsy that came out addressed these exact things, just as you posed that question. It said, we can't do this again. And they didn't do it again, they did it worse this time around. And so I think as much as there's hope, I think on all sides of the aisle, that there will be more inclusive messaging. I think Kristen is right that there'll be some infighting, whether Ted Cruz emerges or someone and say, no, we need to do it even better. And one other thing I'll add is that The midterms are going to come up in 2018, and the Republicans will probably have a better midterm than they have a presidential, and that might give them some hope that they just continue along this sort of path of scapegoating immigrants and maximizing the white vote.
One thing, Dre, in turning to you here, I mean, one of the subtexts of everything that you all have said here, again, putting aside the mechanics of campaigns and elections, is this broader, almost ethical or spiritual question of how do we de-link Americanness and whiteness, right? And whether you're Republican or Democrat, right? How do we begin to get everybody, A, make that happen, and B, if that makes you uncomfortable, to get comfortable with it, right? The work that you're doing, again, both in and out of the system, hasn't necessarily been explicitly about this question of whiteness per se, but I am curious your take, again, culturally and not only electorally on that angle.
Yeah, before I get to that, I'll just piggyback and say that, Trump has done to the Republican Party what the left only dreamt it could do, right? And the challenge with Trump, though, is that when he implodes, there's always collateral damage. Like he did to CNN and to Breitbart, what people, didn't think was possible. And the challenge, I think, for the Democrats would be like, how do you make sure you don't become the collateral damage to Trump, too? Because we still have a long way to go to November. I think that's real. And the second thing is that in the thought of him losing, I do think there will be some sort of clarifying call, but I would agree with you that I think the right will still struggle, which is, I'm not opposed to that. But I also think that he has created a public community of people that allow bigotry and racism to be okay in public, and I think that is dangerous. And I think that we will see the fallout of that for a while. And I think that one of the challenges of the Obama presidency is that people people of color didn't organize under Obama a lot. Like the campaigns were really organized. He became president, and sort of the organizing community changed. Like it just wasn't as robust. People still sort of pushed, but people didn't push Obama in the way that people said they would. And I think that coalition will have to exist no matter who the next president is. Like people of color will have to be organized in a very different way. In terms of whiteness, like one of the real things about the movement is like we have to, I think that what comes next in the movement is one, can we build coalitions? But the second is, can we be as organized on the inside as we are on the outside? Like that has to be a part of the work. And that's what the Tea Party got, right? The Tea Party got like change the conversation, yes, win all the elections, right? So at the end of the day, they were able to change structures and systems, and it wasn't just a fight about the conversation. And I worry sometimes that on the left, we get so excited about changing the conversation. We're like, oh, there's a new conversation.
But not changing the systems of
right.
power.
And then the right has swept all the laws, and we're like, what happened, Yeah. And that's not a strategy to win.
So Stan's, those of you who aren't super familiar with Stan's earlier work, one of your most notable contributions to just the language of politics and polling, was Macomb County in Michigan, and examining these, at the time, coining the idea of Reagan Democrats, who were demographically much like a lot of the folks who are supporting Trump right now, working class, blue-collar whites who felt even then that they were getting left behind by both a changing economy and a changing demography. I think one of the things that's really important here in this, not just in this panel, but I think in the rest of this election season, is to not paint with an overly broad brush whites, right, or whiteness, and to recognize that, yes, there is a chunk of the Trump base that are outright bigots, and then there are a chunk of people who are essentially lost, who are as imprisoned by notions of race and American identity as anybody else, and can't find a way out. And so Stan, in thinking about working class whites today, what is the constructive way forward in this election, whether for Hillary as a candidate to appeal to, or just for folks in this room to try to activate new forms of engagement?
I want to embrace your question, and I want to take it forward because I think we're still not accepting my premises, not just that Trump will lose, that it'll be a transformative moment. And we're spending too much time, not too much time on the working class. I'm going to deal with that. That we're spending too much time worrying about the battles in the Republican Party. They are engaged in a counter-revolution. They're going to lose when this election happens. They're going to lose on, and there's going to be a huge war, internal one, to figure out what the Republican Party looks like. But we're going to have a moment afterwards when we're going to have to say, now, we have the views of equality, tolerance, race have won out. Okay, but now, what do we do with it? That is, we're in a period of rising inequality, stagnant incomes, working people. This isn't just Trump voters, this is Sanders voters, it's broad. We have broad middle class, broad working class, black and white, whose incomes are declining. We have a system that's corrupted. We began the reform era, progressive era, that took 2 decades to mitigate the excesses of capitalism evolved at the end of the 19th century. We began with corruption, money, and politics because of the link of the trusts to the politicians, to the local bartender, to the local machine politician who greased it, had high tariffs. Woodrow Wilson, you had Teddy Roosevelt borrowing corporate contributions. You had Woodrow Wilson saying you had to go for money first. That's if you had to go after money in politics in order to free up government to actually act for the middle class and to address these questions. So we got to be thinking the day afterwards, how does this become a new reform era? And the biggest problem for me on this is the electoral mandate. Because of Trump, it is so tempting for this to be about unity, division, immigration, openness to a new multicultural America, rather than the huge economic problems that require an election that's big enough to force the government to really go after corruption and really have policies that can create jobs, American jobs, and raise incomes. And that needs a momentum for reform. It'll need these outside movements to do it. So I think we should be thinking about these movements, but more about how we're going to push a new Clinton administration, new with Democrats more ascendants in the Senate, in the Congress, Supreme Court. How do we move them to really do reform?
So what will be the vehicle for, will it be some coalition of, of Sanders voters and Trump voters who want to force these questions of money, corruption, and the economically riggedness of our political system?
Sure. Well, what I argue in the book is this process has already started locally. So if you look at Seattle, if you look at New York, you look at California, you look at Connecticut, we've already moved, just like the progressive era. We've already began the momentum for the changes, and it's happened. When you go to African American groups and you ask whether people were pessimistic or optimistic, they're optimistic. And part of the reason is they say the next generation is in the street, and they've become conscious of things that we had become relaxed about. And so there's an optimism because there's a sense that things are happening with younger generation, things are happening in communities, and the question is, how do you get that to create momentum to push institutions locally and nationally to bring change?
So Matt, when DeRay was talking about not only trying to change the conversation, but also trying to change the machinery of the political systems of power themselves, whether that's in government or whether it's the systems that draw districts or whatever it might be, in this burgeoning Latino electorate that we have right now, a lot of which is rushing to register or to make sure they're ready to vote in good measure because of Trump. What do you see happening that's making that leap from simple awareness of the need to participate to actually getting literate in the systems of power, and whether it locally or nationally, figuring out how to plug in and change elements of that machinery? Is that starting to happen in the Latino community?
Well, I think it's starting to happen, but you participated in the convening with me last summer here at the Latinos in Society program, where we talked about how we can do better and how we need to do better. And one of the findings of that convening was that we only have about a 50% participation rate when measured in terms of voter turnout in presidential elections. And so while our numbers are growing dramatically, it's primarily growing as a result of population growth. And we need to do more investment in the Latino community. One of the things we talked about was reinvigorating our civics education in junior highs and high schools. And we talked about increasing naturalization and immigrant incorporation opportunities, finding more leaders and increasing our civic engagement rate. So I think that conversation is happening a little bit. The Trump phenomenon might be sort of like a one-shot phenomenon in that Latinos are reacting negatively to that. We've seen articles about increases in naturalization and voter registration. But there's still so much work that could be done. The number of Latino voters could be 5 or 6 million higher than it is, and we're already gaining all this attention if more investment is done. So I think that needs to continue. The parties need to do it. The institutions need to do it. I think the point that you and DeRay made about the Tea Party, how were they successful, is they were not only in the streets, they were protesting, but then they had their candidates contesting office, and they were able to bring that into an institution. So as we get more Latino elected officials at the congressional or state level, we're starting to see increase participation. We're starting to see that reaction. We're starting to see issues get addressed. So we need to really work on that. There'll be a lot of headlines about the Latino vote, but it will probably still be about a 50% voter turnout rate among eligible voters in 2016, which means there's huge potential moving forward if we can invest in and increase our engagement.
Kristen, this engagement question, when you think about millennials generally, but whether they are of the right or the left, right, or whether they identify with a party or not, this question of whether this system seems so sick, old, broken, corrupt, dirty, that there's no point in participating. You write about this in the selfie vote. How, in speaking to millennials and post-millennials, do you activate a sense that A, you can show up and participate, and B, showing up and participating will make a difference? And participation not only as voting, but just as this full spectrum of forms of involvement in local affairs, in city government, and community life. Is it a fear message or a hope message that's going to move younger people to actually get engaged?
I think I would love to see a hope message. I think the reality of this election is that it will be a fear message. I think that in this election, you have two candidates who are the nominees or the presumptive nominees of the major parties, who in poll after poll are not beloved by the millennial generation. And so I think the strongest argument will be, well, you may not like me, but to DeRay's point before, you may not like me, but the other side is evil. And so when folks say, well, young voters are so disappointed, aren't they going to just sit at home in this election? Young voters were disappointed in the last election, too. And according to the exit polls, they increased from 18 to 19% of the electorate overall. So voting is a habit-forming behavior for those folks who are the older millennials who may have had experience voting in the past. They registered during Hope and Change in 2008. I believe it's likely that they will continue to participate, but for the younger batch of millennials who they don't remember Hope and Change, this is their political awakening, there's a chance that they'll be so disgusted by this that they will completely sit out. A big piece of this, and I think this is a trend that is not just affecting younger voters, but really does tell us about where the country is headed, is this disconnection from the parties overall, where you have a majority of millennials who don't identify with either political party. And if you think about the way most young people live their lives, I mean, there's this belief that you should really be able to customize things. Why do I have to take all of column A or all of column B? I don't have to buy a whole album anymore. I can go on Spotify and make a playlist. So why should I have to buy the whole Republican or Democratic album? Why can't I make a playlist? The upside to this is, well, good, then we don't have folks that are just towing a party line. The bad side, though, is that then you wind up with campaigns that I think are more personality-driven than necessarily idea-driven. That parties functioning well should be about ideas, and if we've moved away from that, Trump could be the ultimate expression of a personality-driven rather than idea-driven candidate. That could be a look into what the future of campaigns are.
That's fascinating. That angle, not only of the ways in which millennials are increasingly a la carte about political preferences, but that the consequence of that is that people will default to the politics of personality. DeRay, when you've been working with particularly younger activists in the realm of Black Lives Matter, and even when you make the case that you made earlier that, hey, voting isn't the be-all and end-all, but it is a tool, and it's a tool that it'd be foolish for us just to not use, right? Number one, how are they responding? And people younger than you. And number two, what is that teaching you about how you have to change your appeal to them? Does it then become about personalities and fear, or is it about something else that you have to kind of tell a different story for them about why they should still use that tool?
Yeah, you know, I remember being in Ferguson, and I used to say, like, Harriet didn't vote for her freedom, right? That, like, voting wasn't the only way that people sort of found liberation, and that was real for us, and that continues to be real for people. Positing voting as, like, one tool. When I think about one of the things I hear most often, it's this idea that I'm gonna, like, withdraw from the system. And what we remind people is that, like, the system, you are part of the system. Like, when you stop at the stoplight, right, the system is, like, all around you, and you are always participating in it. And the question is, like, who do you want to lead that system that you are participating in, whether you sort of choose to or not, right? And that, I think, has been helpful for people. And I do think there are some people who believe, like, some people who want a third party, which I'm not, opposed to philosophically. I don't think we're going to get a third party by November. And there are people who I think that the crisis of a Trump presidency will be like an awakening moment for the country, right? This apocalyptic moment might open up a new avenue of something. And, like, I think that is, not true, but I think that's really dangerous for for people of color, like for Black and brown people because he can govern without them, right? He can govern without us completely, and that worries me. So I think that when we have conversations with young people in that sense, they're like, okay, I'm gonna vote because, I don't have a choice and Trump can't be my president. And we're like, whatever gets you there. I do think, though, that in some of these social justice spaces, there is this sort of push between, or the schism between reform and revolution. And there are people who feel like the reformists are the people who are like, let's vote, right? And that the real fight should be about a third party or like a different alternative to these choices. And my push to people is that, like, we have to focus on the todays and tomorrows, which is like the reform work, which doesn't mean that we forget about the long-term work, that we can do both and.
So this both, I mean, and that is spoken very much like someone who has both been on the streets and decided to run for public office. But I think one of the things that is interesting in this moment, and it's true in both parties, it's true across the spectrum right now, this reform versus revolution approach, right? Either incremental change or blow the thing up. I want to actually dive a little deeper for a moment here on this question of revolution. Okay, so the one thing that's notable about this conversation and everybody here is there is essentially a hopeful thread through all of these remarks here, right? Yet, whether you're talking about some Trump supporters or, I'm from Seattle, which is both deeply blue, but also deeply Bernie blue. And there is a hunger for revolution. There is a taste there for throwing aside the Democratic Party in Western Washington. And it's angry. I wouldn't say cynical, but it is not satisfied with the kind of, tweaks that essentially we're talking about here to a system that over time is going to heal itself. And so I want to invite you each to say a word or reflection on this idea of revolution, and then I want to open it up to a wider conversation here. So whoever would like to take it first. Matt, you want to?
Sure. Yeah. I think that part of the frustration right now, and part of the desire of those sort of campaign speeches about really shaking things up, really does have a lot to do with the last 7 years in which there was so much polarized politics. And we can't forget where that started. And that started with the Republicans on Inauguration Day in 2009 vowing to not work with Obama. And not all, but those who came in with that specific agenda, and then those who came in 2010 in the Tea Party wave with a very clear agenda to obstruct virtually everything he did, whether it was a nominee, a bill, an executive order. And that led to a lot of frustration. We had government shutdown, we had bickering. And so I think a lot of that can be rescued if government starts to function better, if the parties work together, if there's actual governing, if people agree to let bills come up for a vote, if people agree to let nominees come up for a vote, regardless of which party is the minority party. And so I don't necessarily think, I think that we'll see some improvement in trust and efficacy if the parties start working together. I don't think all the way to a revolution is necessary. Not that there aren't some good ideas there, but it's, we don't have to go back that far before we saw the parties working together at least a little bit better than they were in the last 5 years.
So there's a fascinating cover story. I think it's the cover story of The Atlantic right now that's all about sort of the ways in which our system is very broken, but that actually by telling people the system is so broken, it's in some ways exacerbating the problem, and that a lot of efforts to reform the system wind up having these unintended consequences that make things worse. And in the piece, they talk about there's this type of voter that basically is the type of voter that says, gosh, if only we had a revolution where we just swept out all the people in power and just implemented the common sense type of ideas, you know, that magically there's this like package of things called the common sense ideas, and that there's this big bad boogeyman who exists in Washington who's stopping the common sense ideas because they're entrenched interests and things like that, and that if only we get rid of them, everything will be fine. And that the challenge there is that no, actually, the reason why things aren't happening in Washington is not just because there's some big bad boogeyman entrenched interest, but because there are two parties that fundamentally believe very different things. That the reason why one party is stopping another is not because, well, I actually secretly agree with them, but I really want to just, you know, be the big bad boogeyman, but it's because they fundamentally really disagree with each other on a whole host of issues. And so what concerns me is that there are lots of folks that I think want revolution, but it's not that they want a particular set of policies. They just believe no matter who is in power now, that's bad, and if only they were gone, magically everything would be fine.
Revolution for me, but not for thee.
Right, well, yeah, or revolution just as a broad concept rather than as something in pursuit of a particular set of policy goals. It's more emotional than rational, of course. And I think that does concern me a little bit about the anger and volatility that we see in this moment.
That piece, by the way, is by Jonathan Rauch. It is the cover story of the New Atlantic, and I think the title is How Our Politics Went Insane. But Stan, the question of revolution.
Okay. I do think it's that whether revolution is the heart of the issue. What Bernie did with revolution was just using a language that said, I'm the most change possible. Now, but in practice, he's proposing, and what's he proposing in terms of what's the difference between what Hillary's for and what he's for? There's zero difference on reform. They have the exact same policies on reforming the economic system. He's for single payer, health care. She's for building on the Affordable Care Act. He's for 15 minimum wage. She's for 12, but 15. I mean, it's trivial, the difference between them. But what is different is the idea that you have to, through momentum from civil society through politics, push for the biggest possible change possible. But it has to be in the context of what's really happening in the country. What's been building up is a deep frustration that the leaders of the country, and that includes the President Obama, have been silent on the huge structural changes taking place in the country. And I think I applaud the president. I'm a great supporter of the president. I think his legacy will be great. He will be known above all for the Affordable Care Act and for the rescuing the country from the economic crisis. But his economic project was the recovery. But that's not the economic project of most people. We have a country of deepening inequality, declining incomes, a political system corrupted with billions of dollars of special interests controlling government. This is a country desperate for change, but we know how to bring change. It is, just as Bernie has done, we can do a living wage. We can do corporate reform so companies are investing in the country, not outsourcing. We can have work and family policies that change the way people work. We know what to do. This is I'm for it because it creates a sense of possibility for government activism, lack of cynicism about the ability to bring change.
DeRay? Again, on this question of revolution, which you got the ball rolling on, this is not just a conceptual thing for you. You've been in the midst of this push-pull of, in some contexts, being seen as too radical in your proposals, in other contexts being seen as not radical enough, but precisely because of this reform-revolution divide. And so what's your take on the question more broadly than even the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, I think that you're right, that sometimes people want new, not understanding that new isn't always better, right? And I worry about that in the movement space. And I will push and say that the difference between Bernie and Hillary are not negligible. I think that they are substantive and real, definitely in terms of approach. I mean, we met with Bernie, and Bernie so clearly gets economic inequality. Like race, he's grown on, and he's gotten better on. But economic inequality, he gets it. We met with Hillary, and it was, I'm sure she understands it, and like Maya was there, Maya Harris, and but Hillary is so practiced in the way that she interacts with people that like there's a real sincerity question that people have with her that I think is that people feel that. So even when we think about their platforms around race, it's like Bernie covers a whole set of topics, potentially too much, and you don't know what his priorities are. Hillary covers a very narrow set, but covers them very deeply. And those are different things that I think people feel. When I think about sort of the language of the revolution, I think it can be both and that we can push systems and structures in like small ways to be better, knowing that in the end actually changes systems and structures. So you think about the stand your ground, like that was the law that protected Zimmerman when Trayvon got killed. That law got passed and it was like nobody cared, right? It was like this random law, then it got passed in all these states across the country. And now it's like a huge thing that's protecting it's like literally has changed the way people think about safety, right, in communities, and like that sometimes is how the revolution happens. It happens in these like small little ways, and I think that we have opened up space to have these conversations about race, and the question becomes how do we operationalize that in ways that will actually change structures?
Well, let's open it up for any questions here, and I believe we have some folks on our team with a microphone in the back, so we'll start with one right next to you in the very back there. Yep.
Hi, my name is Casey. I'm here with the Bezos Scholars Program. One of the things I've heard in defense of the Trump campaign is that, he's just saying all these things to get votes and he will change in office, which I think is kind of silly because, yay, you're voting for a two-faced candidate, but whatever. So what do you think the likelihood is if he got into office, that he would actually change the way he goes about doing things?
So let's actually have maybe one of you answer that briefly, and then we'll bring in a couple other questions in the short amount of time we have left. Who wants to take
How's
that?
the electricity doing?
Thanks. It's very funny that you'll often hear people say, I like Trump because he says what he thinks. And then you say, well, do you agree with X? And they say, well, no, he's just saying that to get elected. Not realizing that those two things are really at odds. I do believe that Trump would be pretty disruptive as a leader, whether that's for good or ill. I think lots of people disagree on. But I do think that Trump would be fairly disruptive. I think attempts right now by establishment-ish Republicans to try to tame him. At this point, they seem to be working for like 72 hours and then it all falls apart. So one can imagine that maybe Inauguration Day would happen and things are okay, and then we hit February 2017 and things all fall apart. But I do believe that Trump would not be a particularly status quo president.
Okay, where's the microphone? Okay, one right there also in the middle. Yep. Oh, okay. So we'll start with you up front here, and who had their hand up in the front here? Yeah, you, and then we'll come over to the side.
So I have a question kind of jumping off something that Kristen said, actually, that I thought was interesting, and it's the idea that with the millennial voters, there's this sense that we, as a generation, want to be able to kind of pick and choose in the same way that, like you said, we want to be able to piece together a playlist from individual songs. And I think to a certain degree that is absolutely reflected in both a group of disaffected voters on the Republican side as well as the Democrat side. And I think that's where we get a lot of the conversation around the formation of a third party coming out of the fracturing of or potential fracturing of the Republican Party. But I'm curious if we're seeing that level of disaffection on both sides of the aisle, with a number of Bernie Sanders supporters saying that they won't support Hillary Clinton in this election. Is it possible, or is it feasible, that we could see the formation of a third party, or is there the potential for a future in which a growing disaffection among both electorates continues to put downward pressure on voter turnout and ultimately drive this sense of disillusionment?
Thanks. Stan, I'm interested in your take on that as well.
Okay. Thanks for that question, and also Kristen's earlier observation about millennials. While they are more and more independent, and in our polling at the moment, open about a quarter of them, voting, for a Libertarian Party. But they are not. They have strong views and values. And the question is, And part of that leads to them having the biggest possible gap between perceptions of the two parties. So even though their party identification is not strong, if you look at negative perceptions of the party, the gap between the two parties is greater amongst millennials than any other group. And you have threshold issues like climate change, gay marriage, immigration, that rules you out. So you may have making a lot of options, but it won't include parties that can't get past a threshold on those issues. So these are big things going on with millennials, but I think they would be open to it institutionally. It's very hard in this country, for third parties to survive. But I wouldn't rule out that that some of the Bernie Sanders vote and a disaffected Republican vote allows a third-party growth and gets sustained in this election. Bernie. The millennials gave Obama only 60% of the vote in 2012. Even though they participated, their vote was way down from where it was in 2008, and way down from other base progressive groups. Their vote now is weaker. Than it was in 2012. I think there'll be a lot of pressure to consolidate that back, but there's a real issue in terms of House.
I'm glad the Libertarian Party got mentioned, but also just libertarianism in general, because that is a part of where this kind of emergent none of the above movement may find a home is going to be there. And our friend Matt Kibbe, who's here at the festival as well, a former head of FreedomWorks and a Tea Party leader, now runs an organization called Free the People, which is aiming at targeting millennials in just this way, using the language of libertarianism to pull people out of both parties. And that's going to be an interesting force as well. Okay, one last question, and over on your side there. Yep.
Thank you. This is a question for Stan. Can you talk about the blue wall in 252, or I think that's the approximate number, and what you see as genuine swing states in this election, if there are genuine swing states?
Sorry, say that again? What are the swing states?
Yeah, what do is the blue wall really real? Mm-hmm. And what are the new swing states, if there are really swing states?
And let's touch this one briefly, and then I'm going to ask you each just with a closing word here.
Okay. So let me brief, because I could give a long answer, on it, because I do think this is going to be a very different election. There's obvious Rust Belt core of that's where they play. If there's any Trump play, it's in the Rust Belt state, where you have a larger white working class population. We're releasing a poll later this week, so I don't want to pre-stage it. Trump actually has trouble in the Rust Belt states because a majority of the white working class are women. You can't be driving the women away and said, I have a working class play, but we'll leave out the women who now are the majority of the white working class. So the Rust Belt is, I think is the battleground, because if you can't do that, then it all falls apart. But we're seeing in our polls, and you're seeing in polls released today, that in the diverse states, Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, but going to Arizona, that there are potentially huge margins that Clinton is already building up. Florida may not be competitive because of the growth of this diversity.
So, final question I want to pose to all of you, and just you can answer it either with a word or two or a thought or two, but it is simply this: whether you think now, after this election, we're going to still have a culture and a politics of people power, the way that we've seen this election cycle, both in the Bernie camp and to some extent in the Trump camp. Will that subside, or is that just beginning in a way that will really overturn things both in the midterms and the next presidential? And just kind of go down the line and with your quick thoughts on that.
Sure, I'll start. I think that is going to continue. I think that this, people power that has been growing. You've seen the immigrant rights movement growing since 2006 with the big marches and continuing with the Dreamers and sit-ins. You have BLM, which has been growing. And you have now many Arab and Muslim Americans who are active and protesting. And so I think that will continue. That's good for the system, and it keeps the parties and the candidates accountable. And I hope that we can find a way to continue that, to encourage that, so that people are doing, as DeRay said, participating in the streets, but also participating electorally.
I think it's just beginning, and we've only barely today talked about the impact that technology is having on people's ability to have a voice in this process, to organize in different ways. I think there's no putting that genie back in the bottle, so I think sort of people power is only going to continue to expand.
Yeah, I think it's just beginning. I think we're going to see a transformative election. I think a big moment of a surge of progressive national legislation, but that will quickly stall because these are hard changes, and the system, the institutions are not set to make the scale of change that people are coming to demand. And I think you will see action locally in communities and states, and you'll also see putting pressure on national government to really move in these critical areas.
Yeah, so I think the movement is young. I think that people will continue to organize. I think what I believe to be true is that there are more people that want to do the work than want to be members. And I think that there's something that'll change about how we organize that when I talk to people, when we're like, if you do these 3 things, they're like, yes. You're like, do you want to be a member? People are like, absolutely not, right? And I think that's like a different way of organizing. I think that there's a model of organizing that has been heavily membership-based when we think about movements and justice work. And I think that social media has disrupted that a little bit, but I think that people want to participate, and as an organizer, we have been trying to figure out how do we create space for people to participate who don't necessarily want to be members.
So I want to close on that note, actually, about creating space for people to participate. And I think the charge that we have here, hearing our panelists and thinking about these deep tectonic shifts, economic and demographic, that are changing our sense of the electorate and the future of our democracy, really get to this question of how will we operationalize a spirit of inclusion? How will we make sure that we actually, you can say that our system is rigged or democracy is broken, but another way to look at it is we haven't yet fully tried democracy. We haven't yet fully tried full inclusion of all the voices and all the people in this country. And Stan talked about the progressive era and the model that can provide for reform and maybe even a dose of revolution. But I think both in ways that are inspiring and perhaps cautionary, another period for us to think about in the context of what all our panelists have said is Reconstruction. And if you think about, people have talked about Reconstruction not only in the context of the Civil Rights Movement being the second Reconstruction and today perhaps being the dawn of a third Reconstruction, but take it outside the context of race. We're in a process right now where deep institutional structures in our country are getting kicked apart or collapsing from within or bypassed altogether. And the question on whether it's economic inclusion, racial inclusion, or other forms of inclusion, the question is our country capable of reconstruction right now in all of our ways of moving and participating? And so our panelists have been so great at illuminating for us some of the paths forward and some of the opportunities. And I take from everything they've said a dose of hope about where we're going as a country. So please join me in thanking DeRay, Stan, Kristen, and Matt.